Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. One of the downsides of this channel is the fact that I have new stuff coming in all the time. It's because I'm always making these reviews and I've got just new products stacking up. Now, you might be thinking that's totally awesome, and I agree, it's always fun to play with new toys, but it gets to the point where I've just got a ton of them and I got a bunch of reviews to make, and I don't want to do just reviews. I like to stop and celebrate the things that we have. And so in this video, after finishing a bunch of reviews that I did over the past couple weeks, we're going to take a pause and we're going to talk about one of my favorites, and I want to talk about why the Odin 2 is still king when it comes to handhelds for me. Now, I've had the Odin 2 for about 7 months at this point, and I use it all the time. In fact, I have to prevent myself from using it so much because I have other devices that I need to test and review. And the fact is that I always want to go back to the Odin 2, and I think that speaks volume about how good this handheld really is. And so today's video is going to be really laid back. I'm just going to go over some of the basics about the Odin 2 and why I like it so much, and some of the things that I've tweaked both on the hardware and software side to really dial it in as well. After that, I want to do a quick comparison with the Steam Deck because I think that pound for pound, both of these are worth your consideration. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with my final thoughts. What do I think about what's coming next for the Odin 2, and then whether or not there are any handhelds that can compete with it here in the future. Anyway, I think this will be fun, a nice laid back video about one of the best devices on the market. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start by talking about the price and available options, because I think this is the major sticking point of the Odin 2. This is not a cheap handheld. I would consider it to be an investment device. Now, there are 3 different models, and they come with the exact same chipset, which is the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. That's a super powerful CPU that is Android-based. So I would think about this device like a high-end Android phone that has controllers already attached to it. Now, to start, we have the base model. This comes with 8 GB of RAM and 128 gigs of storage. This one is going to be $299 before shipping. Next, we have the Pro model with 12 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage. This one comes out to $369 before shipping. Finally, we have the Max model. This one comes with 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of internal storage, bearing in mind that all of these also have microSD card slots, and then this one costs $459 before shipping. So there is a wide variety in pricing as well as the storage options, and a lot of people when these devices were first coming out were wondering which model they should get. And initially a lot of us thought that, okay, extra RAM means that you'll be able to play more games, specifically when it comes to high-end Android games, and then maybe some high-end emulation, for example, with Nintendo Switch. However, since the devices come out, we have found that there's not a huge difference between the two, at least not a difference that would justify these higher prices. So at this point, my advice has not really been to decide between these when it comes to the RAM and the storage. Those are always nice perks to have, but I'm not seeing enough of a difference between them to justify that price point. Instead, I think maybe the most important thing when choosing between these models has to be the different color options you have at the different price points. I think for most people, the base model will be absolutely perfect. However, it only comes in a black color. And so for me personally, I don't really like black devices. I would much rather have something a little bit more colorful. So for me personally, I prefer the Pro model, and it doesn't really have to do with that additional RAM or storage. It's about these 6 different colors that I can choose from. I've gone through a few of these different ones, and I think that they are really great. And we'll talk about the colors more when we get to the hardware section, but yeah, I wanted to emphasize these are not cheap devices by any means. But even at that price point, I still think this is one of the best values that you can find for the money. Yes, it's expensive. It's going to cost a lot. It's going to hurt that wallet. But once you have it in the hand, it's pretty amazing what it can and cannot do. And to give you a quick recap of what this device can play, it can essentially emulate all the way up to GameCube and PlayStation 2 with no problem. And it can also emulate some of the ones that are a little bit harder to run, things like PlayStation Vita emulation, and even Nintendo Switch emulation on here is pretty great. The main limitations of what the Odin can play has nothing to do with the power of the chipset, but rather the apps that are available within Android that you can actually run. And so there is no ability to, for example, emulate Xbox or Xbox 360 or PlayStation 3 or Wii U. And that's simply because there are no emulators for that on Android. But for all the emulator apps that you do have available, this thing is going to run like a dream. Same thing with high-end Android games. I haven't found a single game that doesn't run well on this device. So that's a quick recap of the pricing and what you will get out of the Odin 2 if you have never heard about one before. If you want to learn more about all this stuff, I've got a ton of different review videos and whatnot on this channel. I will have them all linked in the video description. Now I want to do a recap of some of the hardware and software tweaks that I've done to this device to improve it even more than when it came out of the box. And here's another look at my Odin 2 again. So this is the white model here, but I've done a couple different changes. I actually swapped out the buttons with a different model that had black buttons. And I did a whole video about this process as well. It's pretty simple, but of course it would require you to have two Odin 2s. But the nice thing is you can actually just buy these buttons directly from the company on their website. And so you could pick these up while you're buying the Odin 2 at the same time and then do this swap once it arrives. So here with my white model, I have black buttons, and then I've also added the rainbow A, B, and XY buttons. So these are all original AYN buttons, and I think they look really great. I love the really clean aesthetic of the white model, but then the black kind of helps to offset it a little bit, and then we have a little pop of color on the face buttons. In addition, on the left side, I've added a 3D printed stick that I picked up on Etsy. Again, all this stuff will be linked down below, but essentially this allows me to have more granular control, and because most of the games that I'll be playing here on this device use the left analog stick as its primary control input, this just makes it feel more like a full console. And so those are the two major hardware upgrades I've made to this device. They're pretty simple when you think about it, but it really has transformed and personalized the device for me, which makes me like it even more. Now on the software side, I have heavily customized this device. After all, it is Android based, which means it basically arrives as a blank Android tablet, and so you have to install all your emulators and programs and configure all that stuff yourself. In fact, I made an entire starter guide about this process. It's over an hour long, and it's jam-packed with information, and so if you do pick up an Odin 2, you will be well taken care of. In addition to the video guide, I've also made a full written guide as well. And when it comes down to it, the process is not super complex, it's just time consuming. You have to download the emulator and then map it to wherever your games are, and then also configure all of your controls so that everything will work properly. Now, one thing worth noting is that the emulation landscape on Android has changed a little bit since my previous videos. There are two emulators called Yuzu and Citra that have been removed from the Google Play Store due to legal issues with Nintendo. And Yuzu was a Nintendo Switch emulator, and Citra was made for Nintendo 3DS. Now, these were made with open source, and you can still find these apps online, they're just not being developed anymore. Instead of finding them on GitHub or the Google Play Store, you will have to find them within an archive. But once you have them and install them via sideloading, you'll be able to play them no problem. The main issue here is that development for those two emulators has basically halted, and while they were very good, they were not perfect. And so the way I see it is that as new Nintendo Switch games come out, emulation for them will probably not be super great, but there's still a huge catalog that's going to be playable. Same thing with Nintendo 3DS, that one was a lot further along, and so most 3DS games are going to play pretty well. And so I did want to mention that yes, you can still play Switch and 3DS games on the Odin 2, and they play great, but you're going to be stuck with the last updates of those particular emulators. Now, there have been all these forks and other people who've kind of like pushed the torch along, but they're not quite there with the original teams. And so it's fine. I think that just playing those last releases is still really great, at least for now. Now, a big game changer for me came out a couple months ago, and that was Emulation Station Desktop Edition, but made for Android. And I made a couple videos about that. The first was a setup guide. It was first available on the Amazon App Store, but then afterwards it was pushed over to Patreon, and you can still find it there on Patreon, and I use it all the time. It is great. This is my favorite front-end app for Android right now. It's really the only front end that I've found that gives me a console-like experience. The other ones feel like you just have a cover slapped on top of Android. This one actually feels like it turns it into a full handheld console. Now, that being said, there are a couple workarounds in order to get it to work perfectly. I talked about a lot of those in my Emulation Station setup guide, but there have been updates since then. Now, one of the biggest updates has been the ability to launch Android games and apps directly within Emulation Station. Now, this is not an official solution. It hasn't been made by the Emulation Station team, but instead it's a third-party app that's really easy to install, and it's called Emulation Station App Launcher. And I've added instructions in my written guide if you want to follow along to that. And once you have it set up, it's going to allow you to add custom artwork, all the kind of things that you would want within Emulation Station, and it looks really nice. And for my setup, I just put my most used Android games and then also a couple apps, things for like game streaming, and then also for Plex for my media server. And finally, the last software enhancement I've done for the Odin 2 is to use an app called Odin. This will allow you to change the ambient lighting around the analog sticks as well as the sides of the device. And you can find the app directly on the Google Play Store. It is free to use in 10-minute increments, but if you want to pay for the Pro version, it's a couple bucks and I think it's well worth it. There are two main features for it. There is a rainbow mode, which will cycle through the different colors. You also have one called reverse rainbow, which will do the same thing but in reverse order. But the coolest feature is one called Ambilight. What this will do is it'll look at what's displaying on the screen and it'll change the colors of the analog sticks to enhance that experience based on what's being shown on the display. Now there are two different options here. The first is the standard Ambilight. What it'll do is it'll take a combination of all the colors that are on the screen and then reflect that in the LED lights as well. And so this will give you a bit of a more immersive experience. The other option is called Ambilight Edges. This will do the same thing, but it'll change it by having the left side only focus on the left side of the screen, and then the right side with the right side of the screen. And I found this to be a really cool experience, not only when playing games, but when watching movies on the device as well. If you've ever watched a TV that has those lights around it, it's a very similar experience, and it's kind of cool to have it in handheld. And so really, when it comes to my hardware and software tweaks, they're really not all that involved. It's just a matter of making sure you install the right emulators and then throwing a couple enhancements on top to really personalize the experience. That's one of the great things about having an Android-based device, is that you can kind of layer those things on top of each other. And I'm really happy with how I've dialed in everything with my Odin 2 right now. And so I think that's probably two pieces of the puzzle right there. We have our hardware enhancements to just make it feel better, but then also these software enhancements to personalize it as well. However, there's a third piece to that puzzle, and that's going to be just the overall performance in the fact that this can play everything very effortlessly. To give you an example, you can play GameCube and PlayStation 2 games with a 3x upscale, which is going to be 1440p, but obviously playing it on the 1080p resolution of the display, and it's going to look amazing. Not only that, the device won't even break a sweat. For example, there are 3 performance modes on this device, and I very rarely change it from the lowest mode. The only time I really mess with those performance settings are when I'm playing a high-end Nintendo Switch game, maybe in docked mode, or if I'm playing a PS2 game that's really pushing the limits. But again, those moments are very few and far between. Instead, I just kind of leave it at the lowest performance mode, and then also I just leave the fan off. It does have built-in cooling, and I never really use it. I never really need it. And that's one of the magical things about the Odin 2, is that it'll just play your games. You don't have to worry about what performance setting or tweaking the emulators, what graphical backend you're using. None of that really matters. You can just dial it in the way that you want, and then just enjoy the game as it is. And so that's the third piece of the puzzle between hardware, software, and performance, and I thought that was it, but now that I think about it, there's a fourth one, and that's battery life. This thing has a 8,000 milliamp hour battery. That's easily double most other handhelds on the market, sometimes triple that of others. Not only that, because it's an ARM-based chip, it means it's going to run a lot more efficiently, and so battery life on this thing is just massive. It's almost to the point where it's very hard to actually capture. To give you an example, last night I sat down and I was playing Hades on Nintendo Switch on this device in docked mode. It was running great, and I probably did that for maybe 3 hours while watching a TV show in the background, and when I was done, the battery had gone down from 100% down to 84%. So I lost 16% of battery playing a very hard to play game, but in the regular performance mode and over the course of 3 hours of gameplay. As I said, this thing's battery life is just amazing. And there is something to be said about having a battery that you just don't have to worry about. Anytime I pick up the Odin, I don't really look at the battery life other than to say, okay, is it at that point in the week where I need to actually charge it, or can I give it a couple more days? And so before I just keep gushing even more about this device, we're going to stop at those 4 puzzle pieces: the software, the hardware, the performance, and the battery. Those things in combination with a smaller form factor, something around the size of a Nintendo Switch, just really seals the deal for me. It's just a really great handheld to use. And so I think that's what makes me love the Odin 2 so much. Not only can it play all these games and play them well, but it just opens up the entire catalogs for some of these systems that were just out of reach a year or 2 ago. For example, I'm comfortable in saying this thing is a PlayStation 2 and GameCube playing device. Think about how massive those catalogs were, how many wonderful games that are on there. Those are lifetimes worth of games that you can play, and they're all available on here, in addition to all the other retro stuff. NES, Super Nintendo, Genesis, Saturn, all that stuff's going to play wonderfully on here as well. In addition, because it plays Nintendo Switch games so well, I often find myself playing my Switch games on this rather than playing them on the actual cartridge on my Switch device. And in many ways, it's an enhanced experience because many of these games can be played in docked mode, which will often mean a full 1080p resolution, and so the game is going to look better in handheld mode on the Odin 2 than it does on an actual Switch. In addition, I can use things like mods and cheats via emulation to enhance that gameplay experience even more. And so here we have a device that can play Nintendo Switch better than the Switch can, PlayStation 2 and GameCube at enhanced resolutions with widescreen hacks, which are just amazing to look at, but then also the entire retro catalog as well. It's basically every single game that you would ever want to play up to Generation 6 and then including Nintendo Switch right there at your fingertips. In fact, my only main complaint about the Odin 2 is that because it unlocks these full catalogs, I want to play everything. I want to go back and play through Ratchet and Clank and Jak and Daxter and Sly Cooper, maybe the entire series of those games. I've always wanted to go back and play Final Fantasy X or something like Wind Waker or Super Mario Galaxy. All these are going to run great. My only complaint is that I don't have enough time to play all these systems. I have so many games that I can play on the Odin 2, but because I run a YouTube channel when I work, like 80 hours a week doing this stuff, I just don't have enough time to actually play these games the way that I would want to. Instead, I find myself playing a lot of lightweight games on the Odin 2. These are games that not necessarily need an Odin 2 in order to play, but I do love the controls and the big screen. So I do spend a lot of time playing like lightweight Android games, things that I can play while watching TV. So that'll be something as simple as like Balatro with the Android port, or there's also a new Android port of the Suica Watermelon game. I've been playing this one a lot too. And like I mentioned, I've also been playing Hades on the Odin 2 via Nintendo Switch emulation. This one's kind of funny because I also play this on the Steam Deck a bunch, so I have a cloud save within Steam, and it's not compatible with the one on Nintendo Switch, and so I've got two different games running at the same time. I've been playing the Steam version for years at this point, but it's also kind of fun to start a new run with the Android version as well. And so I am being a little bit facetious, but the worst thing about the Odin 2 is the fact that I just don't have enough time to really play it as much as I would think. Now, I think that most people watching this video do not have a YouTube channel that's taking up all of their time. And so if you buy the Odin 2, it's kind of sad, but you're going to play games more than me, even though I do this for a living. It's kind of crazy. Either way, I am self-aware enough to know that there are going to be people out there where the Odin 2 is a perfect fit. I'm thinking of people who have like downtime while they're at work. Maybe they're like on duty, like a firefighter or something else like that, where they're just kind of waiting for the next thing to happen, so that it just has a lot of idle time. That would be a perfect time to grab the Odin 2 and maybe play through one of your favorite PlayStation 2 classics right there on a handheld, and I think that's pretty amazing. Now, in speaking of all the amazingness of the Odin 2, the other point I want to bring up is the fact that this price point is so high that it starts to compete with another device that I think is super valuable as well, and that is the Steam Deck. In fact, if you think about the Pro version of the Odin 2, which is the one that has all the different color options, that's the one I prefer, it's $370 plus shipping, and after shipping, it's probably going to be close to $400. That means that it's going to be the same price as the low-end Steam Deck. And so I think we should talk a little bit about the difference between those two. Now, to start, I did a whole Venn diagram about this when I made my Odin 2 review, and all of these points still stand. The things I want to emphasize here is whether or not you are going to be playing emulation or going to be playing PC games. Because when it comes down to it, the best bang for your buck is still the Steam Deck, because it can emulate all the systems that we were talking about before, and then some. It can play Wii U and a fair amount of PS3, Xbox, and Xbox 360 games too. But the big differentiating factor here is going to be whether or not you want to play PC games, because after all, that's what the Steam Deck is primarily meant to do. And so if you have a big PC game catalog, and that's the focus of most of your gaming, then I think it's no contest. Get the Steam Deck. The only reason you would want to get the Odin 2 at that point is going to be if you want emulation, and you also want a smaller form factor and better battery life. Now, if you're purely using it for emulation, some of that will depend on what systems you want to emulate. For example, Wii U and PS3, then you are better off with a Steam Deck. But if you're looking at PS2 and below, I actually prefer playing those games on the Odin 2. I think it's something about being a smaller device and a little bit more retro feeling, and so as a result, I like to play my retro games in PS2 and GameCube on the Odin 2 more than the Steam Deck. Now, some of my favorite games to play on PC are indie games, and I own these on Steam, and I also own a lot of them on Nintendo Switch, and so I often will emulate these Switch versions of them on the Odin 2, and I also find that to be a really great experience as well. And so it's almost like cheating if you think about it, where I'm able to play my favorite indie PC games on the Odin 2 via Nintendo Switch emulation. The only downside with this is going to be the save games, because you won't be able to access your Steam cloud saves. And so I often have many indie games that I'm pretty far along on the PC side, and I have to start over from scratch when I play the Switch version on my Odin 2. And so there are times when I have to make a deliberate decision. Am I going to spend my time working on Sea of Stars on the Odin 2 via Nintendo Switch, or am I going to work more on my PC version on the Steam Deck? And of course, when it comes to high-end PC games, those that don't have Nintendo Switch ports, there's no contest. You should get the Steam Deck. Those games are amazing. It's kind of crazy that you can play full PC games on a handheld, but the Steam Deck will let you do that. So when it comes down to it, there is a yin and yang here. If you want to focus primarily on emulation, and I would even say game streaming, and you want to have a smaller form factor and better battery life, then yes, the Odin 2 is a really great example. However, if you want to play PC games, you've only got one real option there if we're looking at this price point between these two in particular, and that's going to be the Steam Deck. And of course, when I say Steam Deck, I'm also inferring all the other handheld PCs on the market, things like the ROG Ally or the Lenovo Legion Go, all of those kind of fit in the same bucket. I just think that among them, the Steam Deck is still the best value. So yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting prospect, is that the Odin 2 doesn't really have any competition in the Android space. There are no other handhelds that can really touch it. The only competition really comes down to the Steam Deck and whether or not you also want to play PC games, and in that case, yeah, go with the deck. Now, another factor worth considering is that these aren't the only handhelds on the block. There are a lot of other cheaper options out there. And by talking about the Odin 2 and the Steam Deck, I don't want to discount the value that you can get with some of these cheaper ones as well. In fact, I like to think that they are complementary to something like the Steam Deck or the Odin 2. I like to have one of these guys around as well. And when it comes to this smaller form factor and performance, I'm always cycling through these because I've never really found the perfect one for all of my needs. There are definitely some that really get close to it. Maybe they're very pocketable, they have a nice screen. I think among all of them, the Anbernic RG35XXH has probably been the best fit over the past couple years. This one is cheap and pocketable and still pretty performant. And so this is a really great value right here, especially since it comes in at about $50 or $60. So I'm definitely not saying that you have to spend $300+ in order to emulate all these systems, because you can get most of the way there with something a lot cheaper. And I think that's the wonderful thing about this hobby, is that we have so many different options out there at different price points and sizes, so you can find ones that's the best match for you. And that actually leads into my final segment, which is to talk about my thoughts and what I think is next for the Odin 2. Now, I think that we may see an Odin 3 at some point, but to be honest, I'm in no rush. I think that the company that makes the Odin 2, they're called AYN, they could wait another year, another 2 years, and the Odin 2 will still be king, I think, on the market. Now, there are going to be other Android devices coming down the line. In fact, I've already had an early preview of one of them. It was the Ioneo Pocket S. I had this one for a few days for testing and I had to send it back. And this one is actually more powerful than the Odin 2 and has a very sleek look to it. It's actually available on Indiegogo right now, and I should be getting a review unit, like a proper one, here pretty soon. The thing is, I'm not sure if this one will compete with the Odin 2 either. It's more powerful, which is awesome, but to be honest, you're going to be limited by the limitations of Android, not necessarily the chipset. The Odin 2 can already play everything that I would ever want, and so having more power over already good enough doesn't really appeal to me. And in my preliminary testing, I found quite a few flaws with the Pocket S. I hope they had enough time to address them, but as it stands right now, there is a bit of an uphill battle to be able to match or beat the Odin 2. And honestly, I don't mind that at all. I love the fact that after buying the Odin 2, I've got the device that's the best out there for a long time coming. The only other thing I can think of that will enhance the experience of the Odin 2 in the future will be on the software side. So for example, if we saw new emulators coming out for Android, or we had further development on an app called Windlater and others like it, which will emulate a Windows environment within the ARM architecture. And that's a very exciting prospect as well. I haven't done a ton of testing with that, but the idea is that you can boot into a Windows environment and then launch PC games directly through there instead. So you kind of have your cake and eat it too, in the sense that you can play all those Android games, but then also boot into Windows and play those Windows games as well. Now, I do think that the software development on this end still has a ways to go. I don't think this is going to replace a Windows PC anytime soon, but it would be pretty neat to be able to log in, play your Steam games on the Odin 2 via Windows emulation. It's only going to be really lightweight games, but that still is a pretty interesting prospect. Anyway, that's about it for this video. I didn't want to get too long-winded, but I just wanted to check in and mention that yes, the Odin 2 is still a fantastic handheld. I think just by the nature of having a review channel, I'm always focused on the next thing coming out and whether or not that's going to be a good buy, but I still think that the Odin 2 is probably the most valuable handheld that I own today. The Steam Deck is also amazing in its own way, but there's nothing like having a small handheld that can perform really well with excellent battery life, and the Odin 2 really meets all those marks for me. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Did you pick up an Odin 2? How are you liking it? Or did you decide to get something a little bit cheaper, maybe a Retroid Pocket 4 Pro? That's also a really awesome handheld, but I tend to play my Odin 2 more. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.